There is a conversation happening behind closed doors in Istanbul right now. A conversation that involves producers, streaming executives, and two names that Turkish television has never quite managed to move past. And the reason you have probably never heard about it is because everyone involved signed something that made sure you wouldn't. At least not yet. But pieces of it have been leaking. Slowly. Through industry insiders, through whispers at production offices, through a fan community so obsessive and so organized that they caught something the mainstream entertainment press completely missed. And what they found points to a reunion that, if it actually happens, would be one of the most calculated and emotionally loaded comebacks in the history of Turkish drama. We are talking about Barış Arduç and Elçin Sangu, and the deal that might be quietly pulling them back together. Now, before you assume this is just fan fiction dressed up as news, stay with me. Because the truth here is actually more complicated and more fascinating than any fantasy a fan account could manufacture. There are real names attached to this. Real production timelines. Real financial incentives that explain why both of them, after years of separate trajectories, suddenly make more sense together than apart. And there is one detail buried inside all of this that nobody is talking about openly, a detail that changes the entire emotional context of this potential reunion. We will get to it. But first, you need to understand how we got here. Barış Arduç and Elçin Sangu did not become a phenomenon by accident. What they built together on screen across their shared projects was something that chemistry-obsessed producers spend entire careers trying to manufacture and usually fail. There is a specific kind of on-screen electricity that cannot be written into a script or directed into existence. It either exists or it doesn't. And between these two, it existed so completely that audiences didn't just watch their scenes. They studied them, frame by frame, reaction by reaction, the pauses, the silences, the moments that the camera almost seemed embarrassed to be witnessing. Their combined work generated viewing figures that Turkish production companies still reference in pitch meetings as the benchmark. The kind of numbers that make executives lean back in their chairs and say, what would it take to recreate that? Not imitate it. Recreate it. With the same two people. Because that is the only way it works. And here is where the story starts to get interesting. Around 18 months ago, a small but noticeable shift began happening in the professional movements of both Barış and Elçin. Not dramatic. Not obvious. But if you were paying close attention to what projects they were attached to and, more importantly, what projects they quietly stepped back from, a pattern emerged that didn't fully make sense until very recently. Elçin Sangu had been linked to at least two major projects that were publicly announced with her name attached. One was a streaming original with a budget that would have been the biggest of her career. She withdrew. The official reason was scheduling. The real reason, according to sources close to the production, was something else entirely. Something that had to do with a conversation she had been part of that nobody was supposed to know about yet. Barış Arduç, on the other side, had been doing something unusual too. He had been selective to the point of being almost invisible for stretches of time that didn't align with any normal creative recalibration. Actors of his profile don't go quiet for strategic reasons unless the strategy involves something big enough to justify the silence. He was waiting. And now we have a much clearer picture of what he was waiting for. The production company at the center of all of this is not one of the flashy international names. It is a Turkish production house with deep European streaming connections that has spent the last 3 years positioning itself specifically for the international market. They have been studying, with almost academic intensity, what makes Turkish drama travel globally. What makes it land in Latin America, in Southeast Asia, in Eastern Europe, in the Middle East, in living rooms that have never once engaged with Turkish content before. And the answer they keep arriving at is not genre. It is not production value. It is specific faces carrying specific emotional weight with each other. It is the kind of pairing that does not need subtitles to communicate feeling. Barış and Elçin represent exactly that. And this production company approached both of them separately, in very deliberate sequence, before anyone was allowed to know both conversations were happening simultaneously. Now here is where the deal structure becomes fascinating. Because this was not a standard offer. This was not a script sent to an agent with a fee attached. The terms being discussed, again according to industry sources who have been briefed on parts of this, involve a level of creative control given to both actors that is genuinely unusual for the Turkish television landscape. We are talking about input on story direction, approval rights over certain narrative decisions, a structure that treats them not purely as talent, but as stakeholders in the success of the project. That kind of arrangement changes everything about how a project gets made and how seriously the people involved take it. But it also creates complexity. Because giving two people that level of investment in a shared project means they both have to want the same thing. They both have to believe in the same vision. And getting two actors who have each built very specific individual identities over the past several years to agree on a creative direction that honors both of their trajectories without feeling like a step backward for either of them, that is not a simple negotiation. There was reportedly a period of several weeks where the deal was genuinely uncertain, where one of them, and sources differ on which one, expressed reservations that almost collapsed the entire thing. The producers held their breath. The streaming partners were updated through carefully worded intermediaries. And then something shifted. A specific creative decision was made about the nature of the project itself that apparently resolved the central tension. What was that decision? We are going to get to that. But first, understand the financial architecture underneath all of this, because it tells you exactly how serious everyone is. The streaming landscape in 2024 and into 2025 has been brutal. Original content budgets have been slashed across major platforms. Projects that would have been greenlit in 2021 without a second conversation are now being passed on or deprioritized. In that environment, the projects that are getting funded are the ones with built-in audiences, with proven emotional resonance, with names that move numbers before a single frame is filmed. Barış Arduç and Elçin Sangu together represent exactly that kind of guaranteed attention. International streaming platforms with a stake in the Turkish content market understand this very well. This is not purely a nostalgic play. It is a calculated commercial decision dressed in the language of creative reunion. And that is not a cynical thing to say. It just means the economics are aligned with the emotion, which is actually the rarest and most powerful thing in entertainment. When the business logic and the human story are pointing in the same direction, that is when you get something that genuinely lands. Now, let's talk about what the project actually is. Because this is where it gets complicated, and this is where the fan community, specifically a group of internationally connected followers who have been tracking both careers with almost investigative precision, found something that the mainstream entertainment press missed completely. There were script consultations happening in a building in Istanbul that several people noticed. Not because anyone was talking about it, but because the comings and goings were documented by fans who happened to live near that area and who, over time, started to understand that what they were seeing was not random. Script consultants. A specific writer known for emotionally complex relationship narratives. A director whose previous work was notable specifically for how it handled the renegotiation of intimacy between characters who carry unresolved history. That last detail is the creative key to the whole thing. The project being developed is not a romantic drama in the conventional Turkish sense. It is something more tonally complex. A story about two people whose connection is not simple, not clean, not easily resolved. A narrative that asks the audience to sit with ambiguity the way that the best streaming content asks you to sit with ambiguity. It is not going to give you what you want immediately. It is going to make you earn it. And that structure, that delayed emotional payoff, is precisely what the international streaming audience has been trained by shows like this to hunger for. The reason Elçin's reported reservations make complete sense in this context is that a project like this requires an enormous amount of emotional exposure. It requires two performers to operate in a register of vulnerability that is professionally and personally demanding in ways that most conventional Turkish drama does not ask for. You cannot half commit to something like this. You are either fully in, or you are doing a disservice to the material and to the audience. And the reason Barış's quiet period makes sense is that you don't rush into something with that emotional weight. You think. You prepare. You make sure that when you show up, you are bringing the version of yourself that the work deserves. The creative decision that reportedly resolved the central tension, the one that almost broke the deal before it was made, was a decision about the ending. About whether the story would give the audience resolution or would leave them inside the uncertainty. And the compromise, which both parties apparently agreed to after significant conversation, was something that honestly makes this project sound like it could be genuinely extraordinary. The ending exists. It is real. It is written. But whether it reads as hope or as loss depends entirely on what the viewer brings to it. The ambiguity is the point. The ambiguity is the art. Now let's talk about what the fans actually know versus what they are speculating about, because there is an important distinction here that affects how you should understand everything I have just told you. Confirmed or strongly sourced, the production company exists and has the streaming connections described. Both Barış Arduç and Elçin Sangu have had periods of professional quietness that align with the timeline of this reported negotiation. The creative personnel connected to this project are real, and their previous work is documentable and consistent with what has been described about the project's tone. Rumored, unconfirmed, or fan speculation, the specific terms of any deal including the creative control provisions. The specific nature of the project's plot beyond the general tonal description. The identity of the exact streaming platform that would ultimately carry the project. The current status of negotiations, meaning whether a deal has been finalized, is still in progress or has quietly been set aside. That distinction matters. Because the story here is not about certainty. It is about convergence. It is about a set of data points that, when you lay them next to each other, suggest something is being built. Whether that something crosses the finish line is another question entirely. But here is the part that I find the most genuinely fascinating about all of this, and this is the piece that reframes the entire narrative in a way that changes how it feels emotionally. Both Barış Arduç and Elçin Sangu have spent the years since their most notable shared work on a very specific kind of professional journey. They have both, separately, done things that stretch them. That pushed them into territory that their earlier, most famous work together didn't require. Elçin has taken on roles that put her in dramatically dark emotional spaces. Barış has done work that required a level of stillness and interior performance that is completely different from the energy he brought to the projects that made him famous to a mainstream audience. In other words, they are not the same performers they were. They are more. They have more range, more depth, more scar tissue. And a project that brings them back together now would not be a reunion in the nostalgic sense of recreating something that was. It would be an encounter between two people who have both been changed by the years and the work and the choices they made. And if the material is as emotionally complex as described, it would require exactly that. It would require two people who are not performing the version of themselves the audience already loves, but bringing the new version. The harder, more honest version. That is the creative argument for why this should happen. Not nostalgia. Evolution. And the audience understands this, even intuitively, even before a frame is shot or a title is announced. Because the fan communities that have been tracking the story are not asking for a repeat of what came before. They're asking for something that honors what these two performers have become. There is a sophistication in that request that producers and streaming executives should be paying very close attention to. Because the audience for this project, if it materializes, is not just Turkish drama fans. It is the global audience that discovered Turkish content during the years when streaming platforms started giving it serious real estate. It is viewers in Spain and Brazil and South Korea and Germany who found something in Turkish storytelling that their own domestic content was not giving them. An emotional directness. A willingness to take romantic tension seriously as a dramatic force. A refusal to be ironic about feeling. Barış and Elçin, as a pairing, carry all of that. They are not ironic. They are not detached. When they are on screen together, the emotional stakes feel real in a way that is genuinely rare. And in a content landscape that has become increasingly saturated with content that keeps the audience at arm's length, that quality is not just appealing. It is commercially extraordinary. Which brings us back to the deal. And the question of whether it actually closes. The timeline, if the project is going to arrive on the schedule that production sources are loosely suggesting, requires decisions to be made in a window that is not very far away. Pre-production for a streaming project of this scale takes months. The writing, the locations, the crew, the promotional strategy, all of it has to be assembled before a single scene is filmed. And that assembly cannot begin until the central commitment is locked in. So we're at a moment where either this happens soon or it gets pushed into a much longer horizon. The window is real and it is not permanent. And here is the final twist that I want to leave you with. Because it is the detail that, when I first encountered it through the reporting that informed this story, completely reframed everything in my mind. There is a reason, beyond the creative and commercial logic, that both of these performers are being drawn back towards shared work at this specific point in time. A reason that has nothing to do with executives or streaming budgets or fan demand. It has to do with something much simpler and much more human. Both of them have spoken, in separate interviews over the past 2 years, about the particular loneliness of certain kinds of success. About the way that building a solo career can be deeply satisfying in some dimensions and deeply isolating in others. About missing a certain quality of creative collaboration that is not about romance or personal relationship, but about the specific kind of artistic trust that you build with someone you have worked with at that level of emotional intensity. They were not talking about each other in those interviews, not explicitly. But if you read those words knowing what we now know about what was being quietly discussed behind closed doors, they take on a meaning that is hard to dismiss. What they are being offered is not just a project. It is a return to a specific kind of creative relationship that neither of them has quite found elsewhere. A collaboration that, at its best, produced work that audiences are still watching and rewatching and talking about years later. Whether the deal closes or not, whether a camera ever rolls, whether an episode ever streams, the fact that this conversation is happening at all says something important. It says that the best creative partnerships do not follow straight lines. They move in longer arcs. They find each other again when the time is right and the conditions align, and the people involved are ready to bring what the work actually needs. And sometimes, the most honest thing a story can do is exist inside the uncertainty of its own ending. Not resolved, not finished, but alive with possibility. Which, if you think about it, sounds a lot like the project itself. What do you think? Let us know in the comments.